morning. The prayer. Lord, the God of righteousness and truth, grant to our Queen and her government, to members of the Legislative Assembly, and to all in positions of responsibility, the guidance of your Spirit. May they never lead the province wrongly through love of power or desire to please or unworthy ideas, but laying aside all private interests and prejudice, keep in mind their responsibility to seek to improve the condition of all. Amen. Orders of the day, orders du jour. Yeah, it's okay. Oh, are you asking? The Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise on behalf of the Government House Leader to move government motion. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I thought that you were asking for unanimous consent. We probably were fine without it in this case because we're doing Government Motion 21, but the clerk, please.
Under Government Motions, Government Motion number 21, Honourable Mr. Nixon.
Now, if the Minister of Justice, Deputy Government House Leader would like to move Government Motion 21 on behalf of the Government House Leader, he'd be more than welcome to do so now.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise on behalf of the Government House Leader to move Government Motion 21 on the order paper. Be it resolved that despite Standing Order 13 sub 7, 16 and 42 sub 4 sub B, for the duration of the spring sitting of the second session of the 30th Legislature, and to allow for appropriate physical distancing within the chamber during that time, all members may sit, speak, and vote in any seat that has not been assigned to them, provided that they immediately relinquish that seat on the request of the member who has been assigned that seat or the Speaker. And be it resolved that this motion take effect immediately on passage. Mr. Speaker, this motion is merely to enable the Assembly to maintain physical distancing for the remainder of the spring sitting. Previously sitting each day, we passed a similar motion that morning. Mr. Speaker, I ask for unanimous consent of this Assembly to take this step.
We've moved a government motion, so we don't need unanimous consent. This is just a passage of a motion. But as a result, that it is a government motion, it is a debatable motion, according to Standing Order 18.1. Is there anyone else wishing to speak to the motion this morning? Seeing none, I'm prepared to call the question on Government Motion 21. Having heard the motion as proposed by the Deputy Government House Leader on behalf of the Government House Leader, all those in favour of Government Motion 21, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. In my opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered.
Under Government Bills and Orders, for second reading, Bill 2, Gaming, Liquor and Cannabis Amendment Act 2020, Honourable Mr. Hunter.
The Honourable Member for Calgary East momentarily.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand in accordance with Section 2, subsection 2 of the Conflict of Interest Act, and I declare that I have private interest by way of ownership of shares of stocks in the companies involving Bill 2. As such, Mr. Speaker, I withdraw myself from participating in this debate, considerations in voting for Bill 2.
Associate Minister of Red Tape Reduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to move second reading of Bill 2, the Gaming, Liquor and Cannabis Amendment Act 2020. This legislation continues our promise of making life easier for all Albertans by addressing a number of out-of-date aspects of the Gaming and Liquor and Cannabis Act. Specifically, it proposes 5 amendments that will help modernize the Act while still promoting responsible use of alcohol, public health and safety. They will also eliminate unnecessary red tape that exists in the Gaming, Liquor and Cannabis Act, simplifying the Act and making it easier for all Albertans to navigate. The first of these amendments will repeal the prohibition area outlined in Section 54 of the Gaming, Liquor and Cannabis Act. This area in southern Alberta includes Cardston County and portions of the County of Warner and prohibits the sale of alcohol in the region. However, much of the Act's language references the long-repealed Liquor Control Act, demonstrating just how much this Act needs to be updated. It also contributes to a patchwork of policy for the province, a symptom of red tape, and an inconsistency we want to rectify. However, this does not mean liquor will be sold in these areas. Ultimately, through bylaws, municipalities will have the final say to allow or prevent liquor sales in their jurisdictions. Second, we're eliminating the requirement for municipalities and Métis settlements to hold a vote of their electorate when the first application for a liquor license is made in their jurisdiction. This is a rare occurrence that only takes place when Alberta Gaming, Liquor and Cannabis receives an application for a liquor license in a community that does not yet possess any licenses. This is a great inconvenience for a small community or summer village when, for example, their only liquor licensed restaurant closes. Because they no longer have a license, the community has to go through the expense of a costly vote. This amendment will make the vote optional for a municipality or Métis settlement, saving them time and money when appropriate and affording them more autonomy. Third, on the topic of liquor license, we're allowing AGLC the latitude to impose conditions on a gaming or liquor license after it has been issued and without a specific violation by the licensee. This provision was introduced for cannabis retailers when cannabis was legalized in October 2018 and is now being extended to gaming and liquor licenses. This provides a consistent approach for gaming, liquor, and cannabis licensed premises and also strikes the right balance between stopping the war on fun and keeping Albertans safe. The Fourth Amendment has the most impact on everyday Albertans. We are reducing restrictions on public school consumptions in parks. This change would allow park owners to allow public consumption without food in designated picnic areas within their parks. This would apply to municipal and provincial parks. However, this doesn't mean it's a free-for-all. It will be the responsibility of park owners to choose whether they want to allow this and then provide adequate signage to indicate that public consumption of alcohol is in fact allowed in marked public picnic areas. To be clear, parks with no signage would automatically indicate that liquor is not permitted. It will also be up to Albertans to be responsible and continue to enjoy all of our province's beautiful parks safely and respectfully. Last, we are clarifying language in the Gaming, Liquor and Cannabis Act that liquor is a permitted prize for raffles. AGLC has long stated that liquor was fair game as a raffle prize, but language in the GLCA made that unclear. This amendment removes that confusion, making it clear that liquor was and continues to be allowed as raffle prizes as long as the recipient is of legal age. Together, these changes represent a modernization and simplification of important pieces of legislation. They also achieve red tape reductions that benefit all Albertans. I'd like to thank all members of the Assembly for their time and attention to Bill 2, and I look forward to a healthy debate moving forward. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I move to adjourn debate.
Honourable members, having heard the motion on behalf of the Associate Minister of Red Tape Reduction to adjourn debate, all those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. In my opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered.
For second reading, Bill 4, Fiscal Planning and Transparency, Fixed Budget Period Amendment Act 2020. Honourable Mr. Taves.
The Honourable Associate Minister of Red Tape Reduction on behalf of the Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I rise on behalf of the Minister of Finance to move second reading of Bill 4, the Fiscal Planning and Transparency Fixed Budget Period Amendment Act 2020, which proposes to establish a fixed budget period. This will require the provincial government to table its budget during the month of February of each year. Mr. Speaker, this proposal is straightforward and suggests clear benefits of government fiscal reporting and to organizations across the province that rely on provincial budgets for their own financial planning. The proposed amendment specifically requires that main estimates for a fiscal year be tabled within the month of February of the preceding fiscal year. An example of this is our government's tabling of Budget 2020 on February 27th. This provides the Assembly with sufficient time for debate to pass the budget and related appropriation bills before the new fiscal year commences on April 1st. The impact on government business in the Chamber is that a February budget limits the need for interim supply votes or special warrants. This means our time in this Chamber can be devoted to other priorities that matter to Albertans. It also means that the Department of Treasury Board and Finance's fiscal planning and reporting processes will be more efficient. If passed, this amendment will have positive impacts outside of government as well. Mr. Speaker, this amendment directly affects all the organizations across the province that rely on our budget for their own financial planning. With a fixed budget period, municipalities, school boards, community groups, nonprofits, and many other organizations across the province will have reliable information and sufficient time to prepare their own budgets. They'll also be able to make stronger long-term plans, as there will be greater certainty around provincial budgets. Of course, as evidenced by recent events, we all know there are circumstances in which the Assembly may not be able to convene, but a more common occurrence would be that the Assembly dissolves for a general election. In this case, Mr. Speaker, we included an exemption to the proposed amendment, which waives the fixed budget period if the Assembly is dissolved between August 31st and March 1st. In this case, the elected government must table interim supply legislation until a budget is passed. A fixed budget period also aligns with a recommendation of the McKinnon panel to help enhance transparency and accountability in government's financial reporting. Mr. Speaker, this bill is about accountability of government to all Albertans. A fixed budget period will bring order to government fiscal reporting and provide predictability to organizations that depend on provincial funds. It will ensure provincial budgets are delivered on time and are effective in supporting financial plans across the province. I thank the members for their attention, and I look forward to the debate. Now I'd like to adjourn debate.
Honourable members, the Associate Minister of Red Tape Reduction has moved to adjourn debate. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. Motion is carried and so ordered.
For second reading, Bill 7, Responsible Energy Development Amendment Act 2020, Honourable Mrs. Savage.
The Honourable Minister of Justice and the Solicitor General on behalf of the Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise on behalf of the Minister of Energy today to move second reading of Bill 7, the Responsible Energy Development Amendment Act. For generations, the energy sector has been a key economic driver in our province, attracting investment and creating jobs throughout Alberta and for those across the country. Underpinning this investment is a need for a well-designed and functional single regulator to oversee the environmentally responsible development of our province's oil sands, natural gas, and coal resources. We need a regulator that is nimble and able to provide producers with the predictability they require to continue investing here in Alberta. Our government has heard time and time again about concerns regarding unnecessary delays in the AER's application review process. Through the AER review, which our government launched last fall, we heard that there's a strong need to refocus the regulator, particularly in regards to the process of reviewing energy project applications. Bill 7 represents an important step towards providing industry and all Albertans with increased confidence in this process. It is vital for our government to restore predictability to the regulatory process without sacrificing rigor. The Responsible Energy Development Amendment Act would provide government with the authority to set maximum timelines for the Alberta Energy Regulator to review applications. This is a milestone in meeting our commitment to ensuring the AER makes timely decisions, also while continuing to maintain a stringent regulatory process that protects public safety and the environment. Bill 7 directly addresses concerns about unnecessary delays as a result of needless red tape and ineffective processes in accessing project applications, in assessing project applications. This legislation also enables government to establish regulations under the proposed act to clarify conditions or enact any rules as required to operationalize the process. Taking these actions will enhance predictability in the review process for industry and all Albertans. Since taking office, our government has taken a series of steps to strengthen and modernize the AER, increasing investor confidence in Alberta's energy sector. This legislation builds on these steps, including the appointment of a new board and the hiring of a permanent chief executive officer. While we are confident that the new leadership will address the timeline concerns that have emerged, Bill 7 will provide us with additional accountability and mechanisms to step in if required. These efforts are particularly crucial as we are working relentlessly to help the province emerge from the two-pronged economic challenges presented by COVID-19 and the Saudi-Russian oil price war. We need to ensure Alberta is prepared and ready for the global recovery when the time comes, including maximizing the efficiency and predictability of our regulatory processes. Mr. Speaker, these legislative changes are big steps towards making the AER a more robust and effective organization. Bill 7, paired with the steps that we've already taken, will strengthen the AER and improve energy regulation to the benefit of all Albertans. I hope that all members support me in moving forward with Bill 7. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I move to adjourn debate.
Honourable members, having heard the motion as offered by the Deputy Government House Leader to adjourn debate, all those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. In my opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered.
Committee of the Whole.
Speaker outlined in a statement to the Assembly on May 27, 2020, the Assembly is following a new process for the distribution of amendments. LASS staff will continue to retrieve amendments from members, bringing the original copies to the table, and presiding officers' copies will then be provided to the House leaders for the government and official opposition. Additional copies will also be distributed to those who want one. Members simply need to raise their hands and the LASS will provide you a copy. Extra copies will be placed on the two tables located by the Chamber's rear doors. As a reminder, 95 copies of amendments are still required. Bill 1, Critical Infrastructure Defence Act, Honourable Mr. Kennedy. Are there any members wishing to speak to Bill 1? The Honourable Member for Calgary, Mountain View, thank you.
Good try, though. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry, we're moving very quickly this morning. With respect to Bill 1, obviously, I think that our position has been made clear. I think there are some things in this bill which are mostly fine. There are some things which don't actually change the state of play of the current law, and then there are some things which I think are of great concern. And I would say, for myself and a number of people that I have heard from, probably the most egregious flaw in this particular bill is Section 2.1, which, as it reads right now, would essentially render illegal mere presence in a location. And so I think that when we're talking about just standing on public land being illegal without doing anything else, just standing there, is now illegal. I think that that's a bit of an overreach, and I think it's a bit of a concern. So with that, I am going to move an amendment, and I will let the original hit the table, and I will await your direction.
Amendment A1. Go ahead.
So this amendment is, it's amendment to Bill 1, the Critical Infrastructure Defence Act, be amended as followed by striking out Section 2, Sub 1, and Section 2, subsections 1 and subsection 5, by striking out Section 3, Sub 2, and in Section 4 by striking out Section 2, 1, 2, and 3, and substituting Section 2, 2, or 3. So just striking out those words and then substituting the other words. So essentially what this is designed to address, I'm hoping, or believing, it's hard to say, that the government didn't intend to include walking along a highway or simply passing the train tracks under this bill. I think perhaps in the rush to draft it, those things were missed. But certainly the advice we've had and my take on this is that as it's currently drafted, the bill does, in fact, render illegal those things. So I hope that the government didn't intend to make it illegal, that walking along a highway or passing a train tracks would be illegal. And I think it's pretty concerning, one way or the other, that just being at a site is punishable under this act, because the punishments are fairly severe, especially for something that someone could very easily do inadvertently without realizing that they're doing it. I think a lot of people would be surprised to discover that after this act passed, walking along the highway would be illegal. So this is an amendment for the government, giving them a chance to correct their oversight. If they don't, then I assume that it was because this wasn't an oversight at all, which I think is pretty deeply troubling. I think the section, as it reads right now, is a key example of why the bill is fundamentally flawed. It's hard to see how this could be fixed, but I hope that the government is willing to accept this amendment, because I think, again, that our largest concern in terms of what this bill does, because the fact that it renders illegal acts which are already illegal, like vandalism, I think that's fine. If the government wants to say, I mean, it's unnecessary, but it's fine. If the government feels the need to signal to people that those already illegal acts are something that they don't like, I think that's okay. My concern, though, again, is about the things laid out, particularly in Section 2, subsection 1, which would give them basically the unfettered ability to render illegal those things which, like walking along the highway, which are basically criminalizing mere presence. I think obviously the other big concern is in 2.5, which is an ability for the government to add things that are illegal. So currently, it would be illegal to walk along a public highway because it's public lands. It might be illegal to walk too close to train tracks, again, in this instance. But I think another big concern is that that subsection would make it the case, that subsection 5 would make it the case that the government can literally designate anything. So they could make mere presence illegal literally anywhere throughout the province, just by a declaration of cabinet. And I think that that is a concern. I think that it would be a concern for many Albertans, because it is a very, very strong power, I would argue, too strong a power to be able to just, by declaration of cabinet, with no public oversight, with no bringing it back to this legislative body, be able to say mere presence in a location has become illegal. So with that, I would urge all members to vote in favor of this amendment, because I think that it significantly improves the bill, and I hope that what it does is actually strengthen what the government's original intent was. So thank you.
Thank you. Any other members wishing to speak to Amendment A1? Seeing none, we'll call the question on Amendment A1. Bill 1, Amendment A1. All those in favor of the amendment, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. No. I believe the noes have it. That amendment is defeated. Any other members wishing to speak to Bill 1? The member from Calgary-McCall.
Excellent.
Mountain.
So I have another amendment. I will once again keep a copy and await its arrival.
Go ahead, member.
Thank you very much. So the amendment reads as follows. Bill 1, the Critical Infrastructure Defense Act be amended. A, in subsection 3(1)(a)(i) by striking out not less than 1,000, and in subsection B in section 3(1)(a)(ii) by striking out not less than 1,000, and in section 3(1)(b) by striking out not less than 10,000. So what these are doing is they are impacting not the maximum amount of the fine, but the minimum amount of the fine. And the reason why the minimums on the fine are a concern, I actually think I outlined sort of in my last set of amendments. So the concern there is that because this does criminalize mere presence in certain places, such as, again, walking along a highway, the concern is that a minimum of $1,000 fine puts both police officers, officers of the court, everyone in a bit of an awkward position where, say, they've come across someone who is doing that. They are walking along the highway. They did not know that that was illegal because it's a bit of a strange thing to be illegal. And so now they're in this awkward position where if the officer writes that ticket, they're guaranteed to get a fine for $1,000. And so that puts people in a bit of an uncomfortable position. And I think in light of the fact that this is, the offense itself is, in my view, a bit of an overreach in terms of government power, again, criminalizing mere presence in a location. I think that these minimum fines are, they're not proportionate. They're sort of a disproportionate response to, again, walking along a highway. And so I would like to give, I don't want to decrease the maximum because the maximum may be for something which actually is illegal, like vandalism. But dropping the minimum gives those participants in the justice system the ability to make a choice and to say, oh, this person was just walking along the highway, and not provide the same sort of fine. So I think the last amendment would have been better, but in the absence of the government having accepted the last amendment, I think that the punishment should fit the crime a little bit more proportionately, and this would allow people in the justice system to balance the scales a little bit. So I would urge all members to vote in favor of the amendment.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Are there any honourable members looking to join debate on Amendment A2? Seeing none, on Amendment A2 as proposed by the Honourable Member for Calgary Mountain View. Is the House agreed? All those in favor, please say aye. Any opposed, please say no. No. That amendment is defeated. Are there any members looking to speak to the bill proper, Bill 1, Critical Infrastructure Defense Act? I see the Honourable Member for Calgary Mountain View has risen to speak.
I have risen once again with an amendment, Mr. Chair, and so I will give you the original. Thank you very much. So I'll begin by reading the amendment. So I am moving that Bill 1, the Critical Infrastructure Defense Act, be amended as follows by striking out Section 1(1)(a) XVI. Let's see, that's 16, and by striking out Section 5. And so what those two sections in combination do, and I'll just read them out for the benefit of the, no doubt, hundreds of people listening at home. So Section 1A is the definitions section, and 16, building, structure, device, or other thing prescribed in regulation. and that is in the definition of what essential infrastructure means. So essential infrastructure lists a number of things, including highways, railways, that sort of thing. This last piece is anything that cabinet designates. And then section 5 is the regulation making section, and it reads, the Lieutenant Governor and Council may make regulations prescribing buildings, structures, devices, or other things as being essential infrastructure. So what the sections I am attempting to strike out with this amendment do is they give cabinet the ability to designate anything in the province. And once something is essential infrastructure, like the highway, mere presence in that location is illegal. So if the government were to designate the legislature itself, presence for those who are not working here would become illegal, so protests would essentially become illegal. If the government were to designate a school, that would potentially render protest illegal. So I think my concern here is that without legislative oversight, this is extremely broad, it's extremely powerful, and it gives the government the ability to prohibit the citizens of this province from going to any location they should so choose. And I mean, that's a huge concern to me. I think it should be a huge concern to anyone who cares about civil liberties. And again, by striking out this section, we aren't striking at what is at least the ostensible intent of the bill, which is to say to prohibit something like vandalism. I believe that the vast majority of what this bill did was already prohibited, but that's not really my concern. My concern is the prohibition on mere presence in locations with an extremely high fine, and then add to that the fact that the list of locations is essentially not closed. It's an endless list because cabinet can add to it at any point. And again, that leaves us in a position where people can very easily violate the law, and violate the law to a tune of a minimum $1,000 fine, which is a pretty significant fine for a lot of people, without knowing that they've done it. And so my hope is that the government will accept this amendment and let go of this regulatory power, because I think that it's one of the big concerns in this act. And so with that, I would urge all members to vote in favor of the amendment.
You, honourable member. Are there any honourable members wishing to speak to Amendment A3? Seeing none, I'm prepared to ask the question. On Amendment A3, as proposed by the honourable member for Calgary Mountain View, is the House agreed? All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. No. That amendment is defeated. Moving back to the bill proper, Bill 1, Critical Infrastructure Defence Act. Are there any members wishing to speak to the bill? Seeing none, I am prepared to ask the question. On Bill 1, Critical Infrastructure Defence Act. On the clauses of the bill, is the House agreed? All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. No. On the title and the preamble, that is carried. On the title and the preamble, is the House agreed? All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. No. That too is carried. Shall the bill be reported? Is the House agreed? All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. No. That is carried. Now we need a government house. I see the Honourable Minister of Justice and Solicitor General has risen to speak.
Thank you, Chair. I move that the committee rise from report Bill number 1.
Having heard the motion as proposed by the Honourable Deputy Government House Leader and Minister of Justice, is the House agreed? All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed, please say no. No. That is carried. I see the honourable member for Bonneville, Cold Lake, St. Paul has risen to speak.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Committee of the Whole has had under consideration certain bills. The committee reports the following bills. Bill 1. Mr. Speaker, I wish to table copies of all amendments considered by Committee of the Whole on this date for the official records of the Assembly.
Thank you, honourable member. Does the Assembly concur in the report? All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. That is carried and so ordered.
Under Government Bills and Orders for third reading, Bill 1, Critical Infrastructure Defense Act, Honourable Mr. Kenny.
I see the Honourable Minister of Justice has risen for the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of the Premier today, I'd like to move third reading of Bill number 1, the Critical Infrastructure Defense Act. This bill, when we brought this in, was at a time of turmoil in Canada. We had lawlessness across this country where critical infrastructure was being obstructed, Mr. Speaker. That is simply unacceptable. Here in the province of Alberta, we expect the rule of law to be upheld. We expect to make sure as well that we provide our police force and our law enforcement personnel with the tools that they require to make sure that they can do their jobs. Albertans entrusted in us the ability to make sure we have clear laws and parameters here, Mr. Speaker, in Alberta. That's what this bill does. It's proportionate, Mr. Speaker. It's responsible, Mr. Speaker. It's going to allow us to make sure we send a clear signal to those that would try to jeopardize the future of Alberta's economy. Not now, not ever in the province of Alberta. Mr. Speaker, this government is going to stand up for law-abiding Albertans. This government is going to stand up for those that want to help us grow and prosper, Mr. Speaker. And I encourage all members of this Assembly to vote in favor of Bill number 1.
Thank you, honourable member. Are there any members wishing to speak to third reading of Bill 1? I see the honourable member for Calgary Mountain View has risen to speak.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. So I think I outlined, by way of the amendments that I proposed, my concerns with this bill. Essentially, the bill does a couple of things. So it does the same thing that is done by the Petty Trespass Act. It does the same thing that is done by the Trespass to Premises Act. So it renders illegal trespassing on private property and on public property, which is essentially fenced off and signed. So in those instances, it doesn't do anything because those things are already illegal. And so we don't particularly object to that because those things are already illegal. But what it also does is it renders illegal presence on unmarked public property. And the critical infrastructure list contains a lot of things. The ones that are probably of most concern, although there are many, is a highway, because sometimes people walk along the highway. It's a thing that happens. Particularly, some people on First Nations tend to walk along the highway to get between point A and point B, and that's going to be rendered illegal by this. So I think that is a pretty big concern. And the fine for that offense, the offense of mere presence on public land, is a minimum fine of $1,000. So I think that that's a pretty big concern. I think it would be a concern really to anyone. So certainly we tried to amend those things, and the government rejected those amendments, so they have not been altered. I think another huge concern worth outlining about this bill is let me actually pull the bill. So the combination of, so it's subsection 2 in the prohibitions, what I'm talking about. No person shall, without lawful right justification or excuse, willfully enter onto essential infrastructure. And because essential infrastructure includes a highway, that's what we're talking about, is entering onto it. Another big concern, and you know, it's funny, I raised concerns about Bill 10 and the government kind of laughed at me, and now they've reconsidered, and maybe they'll reconsider in this event too. But another big concern is in the definitions. So essential infrastructure, that's the things which people are prohibited from entering onto. And the last, there's a number of things listed. The very last in the list, which is 16, I believe, is building, structure, device, or other thing prescribed by regulation. So basically that means the government can prescribe anything. And then in Section 5, it actually explicitly grants the Lieutenant Governor and Council, and that's Cabinet, just for those listening at home, may make regulations prescribing buildings, structures, devices, or other things as being essential infrastructure. So essentially what this does is it gives the government the blanket power to prohibit citizens of this province from being present in locations, whether that location is the legislature, a hospital, a school, a park, any number of things. So what it is essentially doing is giving the government not the power to prevent trespassing, not the power to prevent so-called lawlessness, which the government already had, and this doesn't provide any additional tools. What it gives is the government the power to prohibit citizens of this province from peacefully gathering in places. And I think that's a big concern, because this bill is not happening in the context of COVID-19. This was a bill that was introduced long before COVID-19. It was the government's flagship bill in this session. And so this bill isn't designed to protect public health, and it doesn't end when the public health emergency ends. This bill goes on indefinitely, and it goes on indefinitely allowing the government to prevent people from gathering. And I feel when we look, throughout history at places where governments overreached for power, overreaching in such a way that prevented the peaceful gathering and communication amongst citizens was often a first step. And so I think that should be a concern. I think it should be a concern to anyone. This is, again, not about the portions of the bill that prohibit things that were already prohibited, like trespassing, like vandalism, like other forms of illegality. This isn't about that. It's about the portions of the bill that prohibit private citizens from gathering. And I think if this bill passes, as I anticipate it will, it's a sad day for this province because those are things which are essential to democracy. And so with that, I would simply urge all members to vote against the bill, and I will take my place.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Are there any members wishing to speak to the bill? Bill 1, Critical Infrastructure Defence Act. I see the Honourable Member for Lacombe-Panoka has risen to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I consider it a privilege to be able to rise and speak to Bill 1, Critical Infrastructure Defence Act. In light of the history that we've seen in Alberta of the interruption, well, across the country actually, quite frankly, of the interruption of essential services, damaging both equipment and infrastructure. This is an important bill, and I truly need to counteract some of the comments of the previous speaker from across the aisle here. This is not about restricting presence. There's nothing here that says people cannot be present. To say that they can't be present at a hospital or a school or any other infrastructure for that matter is completely misrepresenting it. What they cannot do, Mr. Speaker, is they cannot willfully destroy or willfully damage those facilities. They cannot willfully obstruct or interrupt the use or the operation of these facilities. They cannot stand, for instance, at the door of a hospital and prevent medical people from bringing people in through emergencies. They cannot blockade a railroad with equipment and fires and prevent the passage of trains, they're perfectly welcome to be present, which the honourable member across tried to say they couldn't be. They're perfectly welcome to gather. There's nothing here to say they cannot gather and exercise democratic presence. What they cannot do, though, is willfully destroy or willfully prevent the use or the operation of any of that essential infrastructure. And there's a huge difference between peacefully standing on the side of the road or peacefully standing at the entrance to a building or any other place for that matter, and holding signs or voicing opposition or voicing concerns. There's a great difference between that and actually willfully destroying property, willfully obstructing the proper use of infrastructure, willfully creating acts that quite frankly are societally unacceptable. And so these kinds of willful destructive, willful rendering the inability to use essential infrastructure are the kinds of acts that actually destabilize society. They stand in the face of the rule of law, and people want to trespass the rule of law in this case rather than protesting in peaceful and non-destructive ways. And so there is an important element that this law brings forth, in which people of recent have thought that they can be immune to the law in the name of some kind of destructive protest, and somehow they should be free from any recrimination on that. That's not acceptable in a peaceful society. In order for a society to avoid chaos, in order for a society to avoid ending up in literal battles with each other, because we've seen that where in some cases other people have been opposed to the protesters, and then the police have to stand between and avoid a literal physical feud on site. These kinds of things are not acceptable in a society that's focused on keeping peaceful protest, peaceful democratic statement. And so for these reasons, Mr. Speaker, I absolutely support this bill. I think it's long overdue, and I encourage all members to vote in favor of the bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Are there any other... of course, we have a 29-2A available as well, should anybody be wishing to make any quick comments or questions on this matter. And I see the Honourable Member for Central Peace Notley has risen to speak.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Yes, I was listening to the member talk about following the rule of law and how important that is in our society to for people to follow the rule of law. Of course, when people don't follow the rule of law, there's always consequences as far as their acts and how they affect others. And that's why we have laws, because we don't want to have situations where people will jeopardize other people's safety and their right to make a living and to support their families. And so the member brings us up about supporting the rule of law and how that can affect. And of course, there needs to be consequences for those that don't follow the rule of law. And of course, that's what Bill 1 does, is it talks about making a difference, or making sure that we can enforce the rule of law here in Alberta. And we've seen these protesters disobeying the law and not only damaging our economy, but also jeopardizing the safety of Albertans. And so I just would like to hear the member maybe continue on that vein a little bit more as far as his feelings and how this can affect his constituents and the people that he represents here in Alberta. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Member. I see the Honourable Member for Lacombe-Pinoka has risen to respond with about 3 minutes and 30 seconds remaining.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, particularly with regards to rail lines, the potential damage that can happen with regards to illegal acts or jeopardizing the security of the rail line are immense. I used to have a friend who actually worked in high-level emergency management in relationship to rail shipping, and the many calls that he would get when train cars would derail or end up in accidents at crossings and these kinds of things. And we have to understand that many of these rail cargoes are actually highly volatile, highly dangerous products. And when we allow people to just willy-nilly go out and damage rail tracks, blockade tracks so that there's the potential of damage to cars, to cars derailing, it puts whole communities at risk. I've personally sat in tabletop exercises for communities where rail lines run through the community. And what would happen if a train derailed in the midst of our community? We have to evacuate the community. We have to deal with potential fire issues. We have to deal with potential chemical issues. There are huge risks to this kind of behavior. So protesting is fine. Protesting is good. It's part of our democratic society. We all support that. Acting in criminal way to literally destroy or damage these essential infrastructures is extremely high risk venture, and it needs to be prohibited for the safety of all people. So thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, honourable members. There is about 1.5 minutes remaining on 29.2A. Seeing none, are there any members who wish to speak to third reading? I see the honourable member for Central Peace Notley has risen to speak.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Yes, I'd like to take, I guess, one final chance to speak to Bill 1 and the importance of Bill 1, the Critical Infrastructure Defense Act. And, Mr. Speaker, I guess what I've learned here this morning is that, and I guess maybe it's not surprising, but the NDP won't support following the rule of law in Alberta. And that's, I guess, probably the biggest takeaway from this morning is they've said that they're not going to be supporting this bill. And I think I guess what's probably frustrating for Albertans is Albertans have seen the damage to the economy of these illegal protests. They've seen these protests go on. They've seen the lack of respect that these people have for Albertans and their right to make a living, and the right to carry on in their lawful opportunity to make a living and support their families. And so to hear that the NDP won't be supporting this, such a basic right as the opportunity to follow the rule of law and to have the opportunity to not only support your family, but be able to go about your business in a lawful manner. And so it's amazing that the NDP would do this, but I guess we shouldn't be surprised, because this is a group of people that have been protesting their whole careers. We've seen support for groups like Extinction Rebellion. We've seen co-authoring of books about protesting. And so all these radical activities that the NDP have supported in the past and continue to support. I guess probably what's more surprising is when they get up and try to say that they support the oil and gas industry, they support pipelines, when we know that they support people and have campaigned and protested these very activities. So, we look at some of the amendments they tried to bring forward, Mr. Speaker, and they're grasping at straws. They're trying to call things into the bill that just aren't there, suggesting that somehow this bill would restrict somebody's right to walk down a highway or to cross a railway. I mean, that's absolutely absurd. There's absolutely nothing in here that says anything like that. And if we look at 2.1, the one that they quoted, it says, no person shall, without lawful right, justification or excuse. So, Mr. Speaker, to suggest that restricts the rights of Albertans to do something that's lawful is ridiculous. So, Mr. Speaker, this legislation would protect essential infrastructure from damage or interference caused by blockades, protests, or similar activities. It's that simple. It's that simple. It's about protecting the rights of Albertans. It's about enforcing the rule of law. It's about making sure that individuals and groups whose existence is focused on hurting our economy, reducing safety, and destroying our right to make a lawful and legal living here in Alberta. It's making sure that they can't do that in Alberta. And I think it's very clear what this bill does and what it doesn't do. And obviously we've seen these protests across in Alberta and across Canada, and we've seen the damage to the economy that they did. And obviously we need just a little stronger laws and regulations to protect the rights of Albertans and to enforce the rule of law here. There's an increase in penalties so that people understand that there's consequences for illegal activities, and both on an individual level, but also on in any groups or people or corporations that direct these activities, that there's an increased amount of punishment for those people too. And I think it's important that we realize that, and the people that want to engage in these activities need to realize these are serious acts. They jeopardize safety, they jeopardize the economy, and they are not lawful. And it's very simple. If you're doing something illegally, you should pay a price for that. And the price needs to be comparable to the offense. And so what we will do here, our government will do, is to discourage all illegal protests. That's the goal. These illegal protests, they scare away investors. We look at things like the tech mine and how that affected, how these protests affected that mine, and how companies, when they look at what's happening in Alberta and Canada, and they decide that is it worth investing here? And of course, we've seen what happened with the Trans Mountain pipeline, where governments, in fact the NDP government in British Columbia, obstructing that project and causing that project to be delayed and delayed and delayed, and to the point that the company just finally said, we're out, and the federal government had to buy it out to have any hope of it continuing. So, Mr. Speaker, we see the opposition here, the NDP opposition, and their friends and their supporters and the people that they help. I mean, they campaigned for federal candidates for the NDP party with an NDP leader that railed against our oil and gas sector, railed against pipelines. And that's the people that they support. And so it's not surprising that they won't support Albertans here by voting for Bill 1 to defend the rule of law, because we know where their heart is. Their heart is not with Albertans. Their heart is not with the rule of law. Their heart is with the protesters, the antagonists, the obstructionists of the Canadian economy and the Alberta economy. That's where their heart is. And I think it does not include being able to prevent your neighbors from getting to work and putting food on the table, and their security. Albertans expect their government to deal with lawlessness and stand up for the values that all law-abiding citizens share. This government. So, Mr. Speaker, again, we need to realize what this bill does and what it doesn't do. What it does do increases fines and penalties for individuals and corporations and groups that direct these individuals to break the law. That's what it does. Is it increases penalties for them, and it clarifies the protection of essential infrastructure here in Alberta. And it adds to existing legislation and is consistent with the amendments made in fall of 2019 to the Premises Act and the Petty Trespass Act. So, Mr. Speaker, this bill is important. We know that Albertans were frustrated by what happened to blockades. We've seen what happened to the blockade just west of Edmonton here, the railway blockade, where Albertans decided that they'd had enough. So, Mr. Speaker, we know this is what Albertans want. We know this is what we need to be able to protect our infrastructure and to protect our economy here and ensure safety for our workers and for our essential infrastructure. And so we know this is what's needed. Now, we know that the infrastructure, it does list in here some of the essential infrastructure. and provincial highways, transportation systems, railways, hydro developments and power plants, agriculture operations, oil and gas facilities, public utilities, electric utilities, gas utilities, coal processing plants, oil sands processing plants, communications, dams, and it also includes, and this is another thing that the opposition seemed to have a problem with, a building structure dividing prescribed by the regulations. Mr. Speaker, when we develop these bills and everything, when we prescribe different things in it, we have to have that opportunity, because a list will never be complete because things are always changing. So we need to have that opportunity to add or subtract anything that becomes, or I shouldn't say subtract, but to add anything that becomes essential infrastructure. So Mr. Speaker, this bill is a good bill. It's what Albertans want. It's what Albertans need. It's what we need to protect our economy and the safety of our workers. And of course, listening to the NDP talk about this bill like it's going to take away rights from walking down the highway, Mr. Speaker, it's absurd. It's absolutely absurd. There's nothing in here of the sort. This bill is made to do exactly what it says, and that's to protect our essential infrastructure from people that want to do damage or interfere with our essential infrastructure by blockades, protests, or other activities like that. And again, Mr. Speaker, we realize that the importance of this bill. We know that we need something to ensure that we don't. There has to be a difference between a country like ours and other countries in the world where they don't have the human rights records, they don't have the environmental records that we have here, and that one of the biggest differences is the rule of law and being able to enforce the rule of law, and making sure that small groups of special interest groups that don't have the best interests of Albertans in mind don't control our economy and our safety here in Alberta. And we know by obstructing our oil and gas here in Alberta, all these groups are doing is allowing other countries that don't have the environmental record, that don't have the safety record, that don't have the human rights record as we have here, they allow them to produce those products. And those products end up on the market, and that is detrimental to us in Alberta, because we need to have these products sold. We need to have good return on those products. And by interfering with our infrastructure to get our products to market, we get less money here for a product. And of course, we encourage other countries to fill that gap in the marketplace. And so, we're sitting in a situation here with this pandemic where where the economy's been hurt, and there's been a lot of money spent, a lot of extra money spent, and this is money that we're paying interest on, Mr. Speaker. And by having this money, or by having our coffers empty, and by having to pay this interest on this money that we're borrowing to keep our economy going here, that takes away from our social programs. That takes away from the opportunity of Albertans to have to enjoy a good life here. And had we had some of this infrastructure built, that wasn't, if we hadn't had the protesters, the people that the NDP support, if these protesters and these governments that have been delaying these projects, we would be in a far better situation, in financial situation here in Alberta, and that would put us in a better situation to get through things like this pandemic and our response to it. But of course, Mr. Speaker, I guess the NDP, they don't care about the rule of law, they don't care about Alberta businesses, they don't care about pipelines, and it only makes sense, I guess, because they've been protesting them for years. But this government wants to stand behind our industry, and we want to get things done.
Thank you, honourable members. 29-2A is available, and I believe that the honourable member for, I think 29-2A was going to be honourable member for Drayton Valley, Devon. That was who caught my eye, so that's happened.
That's good. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to stand up and have a few comments about the excellent speech that I just heard delivered here about Bill 1, the Critical Infrastructure Defense Act. I know that when I was listening to the honourable member, he brought up some of the amendments that the opposition wanted to bring forward on the Critical Infrastructure Act. And I know that I stood a little bit amazed when I heard one of the honourable members from the opposition stand up and say that this bill would stop people from being able to walk on the highways. And I was very pleased that you brought that to the attention of this House, that is absurd, and that we can just simply read the bill. If we go back to the bill and we take a look at section 2, sub 1, no person shall without lawful right, justification or excuse willfully enter on any essential infrastructure. Mr. Speaker, we live in a democracy. And in that democracy, it's always about a balance of freedom and safety and security within our society. In a democracy, we have the capacity as citizens to be able to have influence over the government and the decisions that this government makes. We have representatives that are duly elected that have the capacity to listen to their constituents, to come into this House, to debate the bills. And I would, having sat in the opposition's side of the House, understand that they have a role and they have a duty. And they are to hold the government to account and to bring forward reasonable amendments that would make a bill better. They're not there to oppose just simply for the sake of opposing. They're there to provide us with good suggestions and good ideas. But to bring forward an amendment, as the honourable member has suggested here, that suggests that this bill would stop our citizens from being able to reasonably exercise their rights is indeed absurd, and all you have to do is read the bill. Now, I know that there are times when, as citizens, in our right to freedom of assembly and to freedom of expression and to freedom of belief, we have the opportunity to be able to bring that before the people in some sort of a protest or in some sort of a gathering that allows us to be able to try and send a message to society and to our legislators that we want a particular change moving forward. But we do not have the right. And what the opposition seems to not understand, or at least not have a critical understanding of, is that right to peaceful assembly, that right to freedom of expression, that right to freedom of speech does have limits. And it has limits that are reasonable and seen as reasonable in a free and democratic society. Now, what this law, the Critical Infrastructure Bill, does is actually speak, and what my honourable member did was speak to the reasonable limits that are set out in this bill. That it is not reasonable for somebody to go to a critical piece of infrastructure, block that piece of infrastructure, and thereby inhibit the rights of others in our society to make a living, to be able to ship grain along a railroad, to be able to haul goods along a critical piece of infrastructure like a highway, to be able to shut down a dam or an electrical facility because you don't like the kind of power that it's generating. Mr. Speaker, this is a bill that has had a lot of thought, that is reasonable and fits the definition for what we would understand to be reasonable in a free and democratic society. And therefore, I would commend the member for his comments, thank him for his reasonable understanding of how we move forward, and I would encourage the opposition that as they move forward to actually do their job, which is to bring forward reasonable amendments, reasonable opposition to a bill that will actually make the bill better. And when they do that, I believe that the ministers involved in whatever the bill is that we may be debating in the House would have the capacity to see that it is reasonable and will work with the opposition. However, we do understand that not always is the opposition reasonable.
Thank you, honorable member. Members wishing to speak to third reading of Bill 1. I see the honorable member for Highwood has risen to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is my honor today to speak to the Bill 1 Critical Infrastructure Defense Act. I'm really happy to be speaking towards and support of this very important legislation. I think it's important for us to be reminded of where this came from and talk about how we need to protect our critical infrastructure, not just within our province, but across our entire country. Rewinding back, we can all remember earlier this year the blockades that ran across our entire network in Canada and how it impacted our entire country. These protests were not peaceful protests. These protests affected our infrastructure network from coast to coast. It affected energy, it affected agriculture and manufacturing, and there's nobody within our government that is against peaceful protests. It is a right. It's a right for somebody to be able to go out and peacefully protest. I don't think anything in this bill prevents anybody from doing so. And we, anybody that wants to have the right to be able to come out and have a protest, as long as it's peaceful and it doesn't affect infrastructure, that is something we support. But when it came time to do something about these radical protesters, these ones that came out that targeted infrastructure across our country, we had to come back with a bill that gave us the ability to address this. These radicals were fighting against our environmentally regulated energy industry, the most ethical and environmental in the world. And what they didn't realize was through doing this, they affected everything from our food supply right down to propane to manufacturing across the entire country. And I think that's something as a government we needed to address, and Bill 1 does exactly that. These protesters were more concerned about their own ideology, and they didn't realize that what they were doing put families, put workers in harm's way, and these supply shortages caused job losses. These jobs are how people feed their families. Mr. Speaker, some rail blockaders also put, they actually put the protest ahead of the safety, security, and well-being of the majority of people across our entire country and including our province. And some videos even showed eco-terrorists throwing pallets, debris on tracks, lighting it on fire. There was black smoke burning up into the air, and they were, you kind of question the kind of hypocrisy there when they were actually protesting for something that they thought was non-environmental. So key infrastructure like this needs to be protected. Our rail lines need to be protected. Construction sites need to be protected. Anything critical, and we need to assure the public and foreign investors that if they come here and they want to invest in our country and they want to build an important project, that though they may run into opposition to that, that they're not going to be affected in a way as being held hostage or completely being shut down. Alberta is in the wake of COVID-19 and, just what's happening with the Russia and OPEC price war is hurting right now. And we think back about how there was a $20 billion investment that was happening with the Tech Frontier mine in Fort McMurray and how that entire project was affected in the wake of these protests that were happening from coast to coast. And it ultimately ended up with the cancellation and the pulling of this project, which would have brought so many jobs and investment to our province. We had 14 First Nation communities in proximity to the project who would have seen hundreds of jobs come from the tech mine. Millions in revenue into the province. These are things that we have to be concerned about as a government and be able to protect that. The Critical Infrastructure Defense Act, I believe, does exactly that. The eco-terrorists affected jobs across our province, and I think the member from Peace Notley kind of hit the nail on the head. Our opposition is very supportive of this socialist green left. We've heard many times and seen on many occasions where they've stood up themselves and chanted no more pipelines, and so much opposition from them to be able to want to continue to have things the way they are right now so that these eco-radicals can shut down our country. I guess they feel that is acceptable. This government doesn't feel that is acceptable. You know, we understand that we are the most ethical environmental producer of oil and gas, and that industry is a main provider into government programs, building schools, providing quality health care, and that is why we got to continue to work on making sure that we can provide a surety and protections for our critical infrastructure. The money generated from these environmentally regulated projects are allowing us to invest in our community. I can't understand why the opposition hasn't figured that out yet. And we got to continue to find ways to be able to support this industry. Bill 1 is a great start to doing so. The devastating impacts of the radical action in the past through the blockades was deeply felt. As I mentioned before, hundreds of rail workers were laid off. Farmers were struggling to get their grain and other products to market at a very crucial time of year. The agriculture industry has faced enough burdens at this time that I think it's important that we continue to protect all of our infrastructure. You know, they've seen, they already have to battle with weather issues and everything else. You know, they have so many things that are unknown to them and what they do in the agriculture industry. The least we can do is come up with a bill that at least protects the rail lines to be able to, so that they have the assurity that when the market prices are right, that they can actually get their grain and pulses and products to market. We need to fight back. This bill will create new penalties on any individual or group who damages or interferes with our critical infrastructure, such as railways, highways, bridges, and oil and gas production and refinery sites. Our government will do all we can to continue to discourage illegal protests that are scaring investors, which is shutting down a large part of our economy and threatening overall public safety. These measures will provide the strongest protections for critical infrastructure in Canada. And in reality, if Ottawa is not, and they do not have the courage to enforce the rule of law, then our government is going to step in with bills like this to ensure that we do defend the rule of law. We stand firmly behind the right of every Canadian to protest, but preventing Albertans from getting to work and feeding their families makes a mockery of our democracy. Our democratic values are what make our oil the most ethical in the world. These blockades do nothing but aid our oil exporting competitors across the world, oil dictators. And by introducing Bill 1, we will continue to penalize criminals who take money from the pockets of Albertans and put it in the coffers of brutal dictators like this. These penalties we're introducing will hurt the eco-terrorists and will discourage this type of behavior in the future. Any individual who has committed these offenses will face fines of $1,000 and $10,000 for the first offense. Repeat offenders face increased fines up to $25,000. I believe Bill 1 takes vital steps in protecting Alberta's industries and livelihood, and it also sends a message to investors in times of uncertainty that Alberta is open and ready for business. The COVID-19 pandemic and the economic crisis have showed just how important it is for us to continue to support job creation and investment in Alberta. Alberta's economy and the hardworking people of this province simply can't afford to be held hostage by radicals, or in the words of the Premier, zealots of the Green Left, who are blocking the means for our prosperity. COVID-19 is already taking enough investment and jobs away from the province. We can't allow these ideological few to harm the needs and the ability for the majority to have prosperity in our province. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Honourable members, 29-2A is available, and I see the Honourable Member for Calgary West and Government Whip has risen to speak.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to thank the member from Highwood for his comments. And I, too, along with him and many of my colleagues in this chamber, of course, do support Bill 1, the Critical Infrastructure Defence Act. I guess what I'd like to hear from the member from Highwood, of course, is much to do with his constituents. And obviously, his constituency is south of Calgary, a very beautiful area, has critical infrastructure, and has pipelines and related infrastructure, highways, and of course telecommunication lines, utilities, and of course infrastructure that would be protected under this Critical Infrastructure Defence Act. And so, I would like to hear what his constituents think in regards to enforcing, of course, the rule of law. And as we're all aware, historically, of course, we can look only in recent history to Kinder Morgan as an example. Kinder Morgan, who had jumped through all the necessary hoops and had done everything that they could possibly do to get that Trans Mountain pipeline, of course, from areas within Alberta to the West Coast, but the complete failure of the rule of law to be enforced was something that really caused them to essentially give up on the project, and thus the federal government has, of course, came in there, and I think we're all aware of course, the history surrounding what is now the Trans Mountain project, and certainly I think everybody here within this chamber and all Albertans, or certainly the vast majority of Albertans, certainly would like that project to continue and ensure that we are able to get our resources to other markets within the world. So again, hearing from the member, I would like to know what his constituents think, of course, regarding the importance of enforcing the rule of law and ensuring that the critical infrastructure is there for the betterment of the people within his constituency. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Member. I see the Honourable Member for Highwood has risen to respond with about 2.5 minutes.
Well, I'd like to thank the member from Calgary West for bringing that up. I actually like to say that being the representative for Highwood, I get to be the representative for the birthplace of oil and gas, with the Dingham #1 well being within my riding, and within Turner Valley having the original Turner Valley gas production facility there now being a provincial historic site. We are the birthplace of where oil and gas started in Alberta, and I'm very proud of that. A lot of my constituents are very proud of that as well. And a lot do work in the oil and gas industry, and I think that was the biggest frustration was when we talk about the rule of law. That is where we saw so much frustration from people in my area. they're all for people protesting and have the peaceful right to express their opinion. But when it came to the complete ignoring of the rule of law, the blocking of these rail lines, protests that they've seen with pipelines, our investors, our oil and gas industry goes through a very, very strenuous regulatory process to get to a point in which they can start building these pipelines, from Indigenous consultations right down to environmental processes. And then when they get to the finish line and they actually get the chance to create those jobs, build economic prosperity for our province, only to be stopped by eco-radicals and terrorists that are the minority, it becomes extremely frustrating. We all need to live within the rule of law. That is how we get along together. And we're all for peaceful protest. But when people ignore the rule of law and stand in the way of people's livelihoods so that people cannot feed their families, so that we can't build a strong economy here, so we can build our healthcare system, so that we can build schools, so that we can take care of our children, so we can provide a future for our children. That is where we see the biggest frustration from my constituents in my area, and that's why I'm so supportive of Bill 1.
Thank you, honourable members. Those wishing, I see the Honourable Minister of Children's Services has risen to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am honored to rise to speak to Bill 1, the Critical Infrastructure Defence Act. As a minister of this government and the MLA for Calgary Shaw, and as an Albertan, I am so proud to support this legislation. I'm going to take us back a couple of months ago, back to February. Like many Albertans, I watched in shock and frustration as a small but vocal group of protesters held our entire country hostage. Then came Tech's decision to withdraw its application for the Frontier project. It was a devastating blow to this province and to this country. Alberta lost the opportunity for 7,000 jobs, and Canada lost the opportunity for $70 billion in new tax and royalty revenue that could have funded our social services, education, and healthcare over the next 4 decades. These are incredibly public services that Albertans rely on, and that investment is gone. Our Premier and my colleagues fought so hard to support that project. They worked tirelessly to build consensus with First Nations and to communicate with our counterparts in the federal government and to advocate for our province and Canada. Tech could clearly see the writing on the wall. The growing tension between illegal protesters, police, railway employees was growing more precarious by the day, and they would be held publicly accountable for any violence, not the protesters. In a law-abiding democracy, Mr. Speaker, that's ludicrous that a radicalized small group can abuse the rule of law, the will of the elected, sovereign First Nations, and the support of the majority of the population of this province and our country. Bill 1 is our commitment to the people of this province that we will not allow the prosperity of our people to be derailed by groups seeking to abuse their right to protest. Mr. Speaker, what do we have without laws? What do we have without consequences? In this case, no jobs, no opportunity for the people of our province. They did hold our country hostage by blocking essential infrastructure. They cost hundreds of hardworking Canadians and Albertans their jobs, and some believe they made a mockery of our justice system. What we won't do, Mr. Speaker, is what the members opposite did, when sit idly by while our economy suffered and jobs left our province for 4 straight years. I want to quote the Premier in his response to that Tech decision back in February, quote, "Weeks of federal indecision on the regulatory approval process and inaction in the face of illegal blockades have created more uncertainty for investors looking at Canada. Tech's predicament shows that even when a company spends more than $1 billion over a decade to satisfy every regulatory requirement, a regulatory process that values politics over evidence and the erosion of the rule of law will be fatal to investor confidence," end quote. Mr. Speaker, let me say that again. $1 billion. Tech spent $1 billion and a decade fighting for this process, and in the end they walked away because of a lack of federal leadership, constantly moving targets on environmental regulations, and moving goalposts mean that we can't expect investors to invest in Canada and Alberta when project after project continues to be squashed by this indecision. Mr. Speaker, some governments may be okay with allowing illegal protesters to co-opt the First Nations agenda, driving investment from our province, filming TikTok videos on vital infrastructure while violating court orders, Mr. Speaker. But our response is not in Alberta. Our Premier and the Minister of Justice took swift and firm action to put forward Bill 1 and send a clear message to Albertans and to investors that we will not stand idly by while the rule of law is ignored. These measures will provide the strongest critical infrastructure protections in our country. And let me be clear, Mr. Speaker, peaceful protest is a right, and it's an important right, Section 2 of the Canadian Charter. That is not what we're talking about here. These measures will create an offence for, without lawful right, justification, or excuse, willfully entering any essential infrastructure, including entering with permission obtained under false pretenses, willfully destroying or damaging essential infrastructure, willfully obstructing, interrupting, or interfering with the construction, maintenance, use of operation, or any essential infrastructure, rendering the essential infrastructure dangerous, useless, inoperative, or ineffective. It will also hold individuals and corporations who seek to direct and aid illegal protests accountable. As my colleague, the member from Central Peace Notley, said, this is confirmation that the rule of law matters and that special interest groups and eco-terrorists do not control our economy. They do not control our safety here in Alberta. These penalties are small in comparison to the hundreds of millions of dollars that were blocked from our economy as a result of those illegal protests, Mr. Speaker. I do encourage all members of this House to join me in supporting this important legislation. We need to send a clear message to Albertans, to Canadians, to investors abroad that in Alberta we believe in the rule of law. Mr. Speaker, we will stay focused on growing the economy, protecting the safety and livelihoods of Albertans. We won't be a government of words, but of action. We support our energy sector, which has the highest human rights, democratic, and environmental standards in the world. We know that this is what grows our economy. We know that our oil and gas sector matters. Mr. Speaker, it provides the means for us to support important public services that Albertans rely on, but it also means that my children, that the children of my constituents, the Indigenous population here in Alberta, the very important First Peoples of Alberta, have a future here and have opportunity, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Minister. Are there any members looking to join on 29-2A? Seeing none. Moving back to third reading, I see the Honourable Member for Brooks Medicine Hat has risen to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to all the other members who've spoken today. I think there is a very broad base support for this kind of legislation, and you know, I've always grown up with an affinity for pipelines, I guess. I say this in the true sense of the word, and the fact that my parents, or my dad is employed by the oil and gas sector, so, and I've said this a couple times, and he literally builds these pipelines. So I'm going to start with a story, because I think it just goes to demonstrate just how vast our infrastructural network is in Alberta. When I was younger, we would be driving, I remember one time distinctly, we were driving to Tobin Lake, Saskatchewan for a fishing trip, and it was about 8 hours in hat, and I was a little bit antsy because, as most young kids are, you know, how are we going to get there, Dad? When are we going to get there? How much longer? Whatever. And my dad said, you know what? I have a job for you. He said, count the pipelines. And I said, Dad, how am I going to count the pipelines? Like, don't you put them in the ground? And my dad said, yeah, but there's markers along the highway. So I started counting them, and every time we drive past one, our whole car would say, pipeline, pipeline, pipeline. And then all of a sudden, we started running out because there was just too many. And I think that just it goes to illustrate, I think we counted like 100 between, you know, like Medicine Hat and Calgary one time or something. You know, like it's just how many different markers are along the highway, just illustrating how many networks and how much resources are really moving underground, whether that's water, oil, gas, whatever, it doesn't matter. It just goes to illustrate how vast our infrastructural network is, and really how much we have to offer here in Alberta, but also how much is at risk if we allow eco-radicals to block that. So like I said, I grew up with a respect for that. And I grew up with a respect for the rule of law, for private property, for public property. It was always, if that's not yours, don't touch it. If it's, if that's, you're not supposed to be there, don't go there. That was just how things worked. And as far as I'm concerned, it's still how things work. But I've been quite surprised and honestly quite concerned to see this new generation of woke protesters who are going to rail lines, burning things, and doing TikToks on rail blockades while farmers are losing the ability to take their goods to market. Like, what kind of world do we live in when governments and opposition stand idly by and think that that is acceptable? Taking kids out of classrooms to go and do a TikTok on a rail line. And Mr. Speaker, I have to say, sometimes late at night you're sitting and you're scrolling TikTok, it can be very entertaining. But that's not what that's for. You can't post, you're willfully ignoring the rule of law, you're willfully ignoring that the collective and important ability for Albertans and Canadians to get goods to market, and then dance on a rail line and basically dance over the lack of success for these farmers and ranchers, for oil and gas companies, and for the prosperity of this country. Like, I just can't understand a world in which we would allow that to happen. And to top it all off, when we're saying that we are allowing these protests, and like my honorable colleagues have stated, a peaceful protest is one thing, but this is not that. And these are foreign-funded groups coming into Alberta where an overwhelming majority of Albertans voted overwhelmingly for pipelines. They voted for jobs, the economy, and pipelines. This bill protects that. And for an overwhelming majority of Albertans to have their opinion, their democratic rights squashed because some foreign-funded eco-radical, I have to choose my words carefully there, Madam Speaker, because it really makes me angry, to come in here and dictate to us what our prosperity will be because of the feeling they had that day or a paycheck they're receiving from Greenpeace, I have a problem with that. So I guess that brings us to the question, this was brought forward by the Honourable Minister of Justice and the Premier about 3 months ago, and many people would be saying, well, I don't see very many protests happening now, and Madam Speaker, and why is this really needed? Why is it necessary right now at this moment? We need to be proactive. And so often, governments get put in positions where you have to react to positions that are happening or react to things that are going on. I mean, the COVID-19 crisis, you can prepare all you want, but at one point you have to react and be there for your citizens, and there's nothing wrong with that. But by passing Bill 1 here today, we are able to act proactively, get in front of these issues, and ensure that we can preserve the success of our economy, as well as the success of grain farmers and others who are losing up to $50 million per week under the blockades. Investor confidence, the Honourable Minister of Children's Services spoke about this at length, and her words were very poignant because investor confidence did take a knock. We lost the Tech Frontier project. We have lost countless other projects that I'm sure many of us will never even hear about because there was companies and job creators who are looking at Alberta or looking at Canada more fully and saying, you guys are trying your best, but I'm not taking a chance there. And I don't, that's just, I can't imagine a world in where we would let that happen, but we have an opposition who's virtually silent on this except for, chanting no more pipelines, or maybe they're silent because they'd rather be on the side of the protesters. I don't know. I wouldn't impugn a motive there or anything like that, but there certainly begs a question of why they wouldn't get up and speak to this. And, we know that especially in this pandemic, especially now, having infrastructure, having that stable and reliable source for food, for Albertans to be able to live and get what they need is essential. And we've seen how many people are celebrating our farmers right now. We've seen, everybody's all of a sudden really happy that they have food on their kitchen table. But just 3 short months ago, the opposition didn't even care that their goods were being blocked from getting to market. Just as a refresher, you don't get paid until your grain reaches market. That needs to happen. So it's beyond me why anyone would oppose this. But the pandemic did bring into sharp focus just how important reliable infrastructure is, and especially the need for reliable and stable economies. And I just want to say, Madam Speaker, in closing, that I'm so happy to be able to support this. And the fact that this used to be just a private member's bill, I had these musings a couple months ago and was looking for a private member's bill, and this came up. And I'm not going to lie, when I heard that the government was taking it on, I was kind of bummed, because I thought, oh darn, like there goes my idea. But at the same time, how great is that? Because this is now, it's showing that this idea has the strength of the entire Alberta government behind it, because it is a priority for our government to respect the rule of law and ensure that our economy is protected for decades to come. So on that note, Madam Speaker, I'm happy to support this legislation. I would encourage the opposition to do the same, and thank you.
Standing Order 29-2A is available. I see the Honourable Minister of Children's Services.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I just want to say I always appreciate the debates by the member from Brooks Medicine Hat. I appreciate her unwavering support for our agriculture industry, our energy sector, farmers, oil and gas workers. But what I also really appreciate is just that she brings this vision and this very succinct way of summarizing the rural Albertan value of common sense. And so I do want to thank her for her words today, but I also want to ask, I mean, I know a lot about her area. There is a lot of agriculture, obviously a lot of supply chain, and a lot of oil and gas workers, including members of her own family. And so I do want to ask a question today about what the impact of these things, these illegal protests, disruptions to our supply chain. I mean, taking us back pre-COVID, obviously, things looked a little bit different and there was a lot of risks to our economy. What does that look like for your constituency specifically?
Right, here. Honourable Member for Brooks Medicine Hat.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you to the Honourable Minister of Children's Services for that important question and those, I would say, undeserved compliments, but it was quite nice of her. The question was surrounding the impacts of this on my constituency specifically. Brooks Medicine Hat is right in the heart of the prairies. I mean, we have an abundance of oil and gas as well, especially gas, and many men and women who work in that industry and rely on that to feed their families. And the impacts of a struggling oil and gas sector or farmers not being able to get their resources to market, I mean, one needs to look no further than the local hockey teams who won't have sponsors, or the kids who won't be going to music lessons this year. Or I know there was actually somebody fundraising. This was for COVID, but it just goes to show how these things all lean on each other. When people aren't working, they can't send their kids to music lessons. They can't do extracurricular activities. They're not going for dinner. They're not supporting hotels. They're not traveling. It's really hard for communities like ours and mine specifically to get by when you don't have that reliable revenue, that reliable income for families. I know in my own family, I can think. It's quite fresh in my mind, the last two financial crises that we've had and the crashes in our oil and gas sector. There was a time where my own father struggled to find work for over a year. And it wasn't for lack of trying, Madam Speaker. It wasn't for lack of trying of anyone that in his crew or anything at all. It was that there was none. And that was instability in the marketplace, Madam Speaker. That wasn't because we didn't have resources to harvest and to use, and it wasn't because we didn't have people who were willing to go to work. It was because governments had created conditions in which success was virtually impossible, Madam Speaker. And we need to take that on as a government. We need to put that on our shoulders and say, you know what, it is our obligation to step out of the way, make sure that we can reduce the regulatory burden, make sure that we can do everything in our power to create the conditions for success. So when something like a blockade happens, I know that I had farmers in my own riding who couldn't get to Carsland to get fuel. I had oil and gas workers in my riding who were messaging me saying, you know, MLA for Brooks Medicine Hat, because I can't use my name, what am I going to do? How am I going to continue in this sector? I've put years and years into this. I put so much investment. I've provided jobs for 50 people. I've this, that, and the other thing. And they can't go on when governments are standing in the way of their success, Madam Speaker. So I just want to thank the Minister of Children's Services for giving me the opportunity to talk about my constituents. I like to say that I brag a lot about them because they're pretty great, but they're all so hardworking, Madam Speaker, and it actually makes me a little bit emotional because they work so hard and they do everything that they can, but at the end of the day, they need a government who cares about their ability to put food on the table. And for the last 4 years, they didn't feel that there was one. And I'm happy to stand here as the member for Brooks Medicine Hat, the first member for Brooks Medicine Hat since we're a new electoral district, and say that ours is a government that cares. Ours is a government that will stand up for the rule of law and make sure that there are the conditions possible to get you back to work. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
20 seconds under 29-2A. Seeing none, are there any other members wishing to speak? Seeing none, would the Honourable Minister like to close debate?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And again, just want to thank the legislature and everyone here in the House for this thoughtful debate today that we've had on this Critical Infrastructure Defence Act, as well as I'd like to thank the member from Brooks Medicine Hat for the work in advance as a private member on this thought process, which led ultimately to the government taking on Bill number 1, the Critical Infrastructure Defence Act that was moved by the Premier. Again, this is an important bill. I encourage everyone in this House to vote in favour of it.
The Honourable Minister of Justice has moved on behalf of the Honourable Premier third reading of Bill 3, the Critical Infrastructure Defence Act. Those in favour of the motion for third reading, all those, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. No. So carried. A division has been called. Ring the bells.
Honorable members, a division has been called on third reading of Bill 1, the Critical Infrastructure Defense Act. All those in favor, please rise.
The Honourable Mr. Kenny, the Honourable Mr. Schweitzer, Mrs. Pitt, Mr. Lowen, the Honourable Mrs. Sawney, the Honourable Mr. Wilson, the Honourable Mr. Dreeshen, Mr. Orr, Mr. Amory, the Honourable Miss Schultz, Mr. Ellis, the Honourable Mr. Luwan, the Honourable Mrs. Ahir, the Honourable Mr. Yassine, Miss Glasgow, Mr. Reed, Miss Lovely, Mr. Horner, Miss Isaac, Mr. Newdorf, Mr. Rutherford, Miss Rosen, Mr. Sigurdsson, Mr. Rosewell. Mr. Hunter, or sorry, pardon me, Mr. Hanson, Mr. Barnes, Mr. Smith, Mr. Milliken, Mr. Singh, and Mr. Ream.
All those opposed, please rise.
Miss Ganley, Mr. Schmidt, Miss Pancholi, Member Irwin, Mr. Nielsen, Mr. Cece.
For the motion, 30, against 6.
Motion is carried and so ordered.
Bill 1, Critical Infrastructure Defense Act, is now read a third time. It's Bill 4, right? 4. Bill 4, Fiscal Planning under Government Motions, Government Bills and Orders for second reading. Bill 4, Fiscal Planning and Transparency Fixed Budget Period Amendment Act 2020. Adjourned debate. Honourable Mr. Hunter.
Honourable members, we are at second reading of Bill 4. Is there anyone wishing to join in the debate? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Whitemud.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise today to speak to Bill 4, the Fiscal Planning and Transparency Act Fixed Budget Period Amendment Act. I rise today to comment on this bill. It is a bill that, in theory, we can absolutely within this House find some support for. The idea of providing some transparency, some predictability to Albertans, and particularly to those Albertans who rely on funding support, grants, service support from the federal or from the provincial government. It's incredibly important that there be some predictability in the way that budgets are tabled. And actually, we have no better example than that, than the first year of this current government's term. Because as we know, this government did not table a budget after the provincial election in April. They waited until October to do so. And while that's not necessarily uncommon, because I recall that the previous NDP government did that as well, they waited. But what they did do, the NDP government, was they provided some certainty to organizations, particularly those who rely heavily on provincial funding, such as school boards and municipalities, about the predictability of the funding that would be coming. And they basically actually passed measures to ensure that the funding that was being provided would be maintained until the new budget was tabled. And there was some predictability there for school boards any time right after an election. We saw quite the opposite happen last year when the provincial budget was not tabled until October of 2019. In that time period specifically, organizations like municipalities and school boards really suffered from that because they had to make projections, as school boards do. It's part of their budget period to make decisions about their upcoming school year. In April, May, that's when they're doing a lot of their budget work. They're figuring out how many staff they have, who they can actually, how many students they predict they're going to have, how they're going to organize transportation. All of those decisions and budgeting decisions are made in April and May for school boards in particular. And what we saw happen last year was actually that the uncertainty, not only by the fact that a budget was not tabled by this current government, but actually because the government made a number of misleading statements about what would be coming in terms of funding. For example, in the first session of this legislature, we had the Minister of Education and the Finance Minister stand up and tell school boards, for example, that enrollment growth would be funded. They were quite proud of that statement after the official opposition had been holding them to account on that for quite some time. They seemed quite proud to make that announcement, but then we quickly found out in their budget that they tabled in October that they did not fund enrollment growth at all, actually. And that created a real hardship for school boards, not only because they had been counting on the promises and the statements made by ministers of this government, but they actually had hired staff, and they were well actually into the school year, into the 2019-2020 school year, before they got delivered the blow, which was the education budget for each school board in the fall by this government. And those budgets, we are still dealing with the consequences of the underfunding from that budget and the fact that school boards did not have the ability to make the plans that they needed to because they relied on statements that were misleading from cabinet ministers about that funding. So more than ever, we have a great example of the importance of having clear budgeting, budget delivered in a timely fashion so that those organizations in our system can plan appropriately. And so, of course, we know that there's always going to be some challenges with respect to unprecedented events. We certainly, I don't think we've had a better example than that of unprecedented disruptive events taking place in this province than we have in the last few months. But I do think some predictability where it is appropriate and where it's possible is very important. So while it's good that the government is bringing forward this Amendment Act to actually provide some level of certainty with respect to when the provincial government will be responsible for delivering a budget, I'm disappointed to see that they didn't actually take the recommendation from their own McKinnon panel, their blue ribbon panel, which we certainly see as provided the template and the marching orders for this government to make severe cuts in education and post-secondary and healthcare, and for this government to proceed with those cuts, even in light of the pandemic that we've been experiencing. Certainly, with many respects, the government has taken that blue ribbon panel report as their mantra. It's actually been their marching orders. But yet, on this instance, they actually chose not to follow the specific recommendation that was contained within the McKinnon panel report. And in particular, recommendation number 25 in the McKinnon panel report indicated actually that a specific budget date should be set for predictability. And in that respect, the report refers to what takes place in British Columbia. So, for example, in British Columbia, they have a specific date, or what they say is the third Thursday in February, is when the provincial budget will be tabled. And that's actually the specific recommendation from the McKinnon panel report. They support the idea of a predictable date upon which the budget will be tabled. Unfortunately, what we see here with Bill 4 is a budget period, a period of time. Somewhere within the month of February is when the current government is suggesting that a budget would be tabled. Now, I again say that I believe in and support the idea of predictable budgets being tabled, but I wonder why the government would choose to not follow the specific, very specific recommendation of the McKinnon panel report and put in a specific date. And that's a question that I'm hoping, as we proceed further in debate on Bill 4, that we have a little bit of a discussion about what was the rationale, the reasoning, for example, for not following that specific recommendation. It really means that this legislation is quite it's quite thin, it's quite weak. I could probably read out the specific provisions of the bill right now, and it would probably only eat up about 10% of my time, not even that. It is quite weak legislation without that fixed budget date, which is the certainty that I believe municipalities, school boards, and Albertans are truly looking for. And I would invite the government members to comment on why that wasn't the case. So it seems to me that this is I don't know, a measure to look like they're providing some transparency, some certainty, but they haven't carried through 100% as they should. And particularly right now, I think Albertans are looking at this time of great challenge and unpredictability. They're looking for great certainty. And I invite the government to actually to do that, to provide that specific, that certainty within this legislation that is in accordance with the McKinnon panel report. So it seems, these are the kinds of things that I would like to hear from the government with respect to what their rationale was for not following that recommendation. I would like to hear a little bit about whether or not there should perhaps be any penalties imposed upon any government, or particularly perhaps a finance minister who fails to actually follow the specific requirements of this legislation and table a budget within the time period set out. Because I do have to say, Albertans have a little bit of a lack of faith right now in this government following the rule of law, a phrase we heard used quite regularly today, which was, I actually, as a lawyer myself by profession, very much believe in the rule of law. But I've been disappointed since I've been in this House and in this chamber to see that the government does not seem to feel the same way, whether it be closing debate on very significant issues, omnibus bills, firing elections commissioners who are investigating into them, into their members, their leader, their leadership race. I think right now a lot of Albertans don't have a lot of faith in this government's commitment to the rule of law. And so, again, I invite the government to provide a little bit more assurances to Albertans by putting in some penalties, for example, if they don't follow their own legislation, because I think at this point in time, Albertans feel like that's a very real possibility. And so I think that's a good conversation to have, and I'm hopeful that when we get to Committee of the Whole, for example, on this bill, that we will have a discussion about proposed amendments to this bill that will consider that issue, and perhaps that the government would like to respond and consider those amendments very carefully, because the intent of this legislation is to provide certainty and assurances to Albertans, which I believe the government has a lot of work to do to provide those things. I invite the government to consider those kinds of questions and those possible amendments as ways to really provide and meet the objectives that they've set out in this legislation. So thank you, Madam Speaker. It's been a pleasure to rise and speak to this bill, and I look forward to doing so again in the future.
29(2)A is available. Are there any members wishing to offer some comments? Seeing none, are there any other speakers to bill? Seeing the honourable member for Calgary-Buffalo.
Much, Madam Speaker. Madam Chair, Bill 4, Fiscal Planning and Transparency Act, Fixed Budget Period Amendment Act, as my colleague who just spoke previously was talking about. There's parts of this that are supportive. There's parts of this bill that make sense. It's very thin, easy read. That's not the part I'm talking about. The part that I'm talking about is, of course, the transparency. And while this does purport to be transparent in terms of when budgets or main estimates are brought forward, it's a budget period. And unfortunately, that's not shooting very high. The previous government, of course, didn't have the benefit of a Bill 4. We were doing a number of things, hundreds of things, to try and correct the issues that were brought forward by decades and decades of mismanagement by the PC government in this province. And had we been able to get to this in due time, we would have got to a Fiscal Planning Transparency Act. I'm confident to say that it would have been a fixed date Amendment Act and not a fixed period. There's 28 days in February, and any one of them can be the opportunity to bring forward a budget under this Bill 4. Doesn't really provide a great deal of predictability when that is coming forward. Could be one of 28 days, and in Vegas, that's a pretty big risk in terms of putting money down on what day the budget's coming forward. And groups and organizations and institutions throughout this province, of course, as my colleague from Edmonton was saying, look to the the budget and try and understand what the implications for their funding, for their planning will be. And if it's not predictable in terms of a date, then they're really shooting in the dark. So the other things that aren't apparent in this bill is that there's no real sanction for the Minister of Finance or entire cabinet if they don't meet the provisions of this bill, though you'd think they'd probably try and follow it. If they set up a law in this province, they'd probably try and keep to it. But there are no sanctions or incentives to that matter, no carrots or sticks to ensure that they actually abide to the period that is identified in this bill. And so that's an issue, and perhaps that Committee of the Whole will be in a position to bring forward recommendations to deal with that, and members of the other side will see the sense in putting some carrots and sticks in place so that there's some actual teeth behind the Fiscal Planning and Transparency Amendment Act, which is woefully missing at this point in time. As my colleague from Edmonton just said a few minutes ago, this bill has as much to do with the recommendations from the McKinnon panel as perhaps the NHL hockey season this year will have to do with great hockey. It's a challenge to see any kind of build up to the season. It may come back, but the McKinnon panel made a specific recommendation, and that specific recommendation is not found in this bill at all. It purports to follow the McKinnon panel recommendations, but a date and a period are two different things, and I think everybody knows that. And so this is not a recommendation that's being adhered to from the McKinnon panel. As I said, it's an extremely short, thin bill, and it is missing. It could have been better by including some sanctions for Cabinet and the Minister of Finance for not adhering to the bill. Those aren't in here. Could have been better improved by having a fixed election date. That's not in here. And this legislation hopefully can be made better at Committee of the Whole, and we'll certainly have an opportunity to bring forward those recommendations. And as I said, looking for the support of the other side to make that happen. With that, Madam Speaker, I'm going to take my position. Thank you very much.
Honourable Member, Standing Order 29-2A is available. Seeing none, any other members wishing to speak? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Ellerslie. My apologies, Edmonton Decore.
It's still the same city, Madam Speaker, so it's close enough. Yeah, north side, south side, it's all great. No, I appreciate you recognizing me this morning to speak to Bill for the Fiscal Planning and Transparency Fixed Budget Period, Amendment Act 2020. Something that was brought forward allowing a window for the budget to be presented. And while I'm not necessarily saying that, we can't support this, sometimes when I was involved in negotiations in the labor world, you always want the best language you can get. The reality is sometimes you don't always get that, but at least this is something rather than nothing. But, they did leave quite a large period available open with the month of February. I think my colleague there had mentioned there's 28 different days that are available to maybe just wildly pick. And so I guess I wonder why, based on the McKinnon report that this UCP government has held in very, very high esteem, refer back to it on many, many occasions about what needs to be done. And this was a very, very specific recommendation within that around establishing a fixed date, not a fixed period, a fixed date. And so I'm now starting to wonder why was it on this particular item that the government decided that, well, we're not going to follow that one. We're going to do our thing over here. And yet there was other instances where we saw the government saying, well, this is what the panel said that we need to do, and we're going to do it come hell or high water, Madam Speaker. And so little, I guess, confused about why we would just sort of abandon that particular item there. As some of my colleagues have also mentioned as well, I see a bit of a lack of potential penalties or consequences for not hitting this proposed window, which I have to say now, when you have one instance of I guess a deflection of responsibility, so be it. But now we're seeing a second deflection of responsibility here. And, I mentioned Bill 14, where the government put in some language around you can't hold us responsible if things go sideways. And so now we start to see a pattern starting to form here, Madam Speaker, where the government is prepared to present legislation that they're starting to wonder, well, it might or might not work, but just in case, don't hold us responsible. And so that does not provide confidence to Albertans that their government knows what they're doing. It leaves a lot of uncertainty out there. As my colleague from Edmonton, Whitemud, very, very eloquently talked about, school boards needing to have some certainty around their budgets, how they can plan for those kinds of things. And so here we are talking about a fixed budget period, and yet there's no consequences and no responsibility if we can't even hit this budget period. So again, I'm always getting hung up on the language, Madam Speaker, where we're saying one thing, we're printing something else, and then we're doing something else on top of that. So that creates confusion, it creates uncertainty, something that has been talked about from many members of the government and the government caucus. And yet here we are creating uncertainty because we really don't know whether we're going to hit this period or not. And I think it's probably worth mentioning, especially since we've heard it many, many times. Not that I was keeping track of this morning, but I think we heard it up to as many as a dozen times about the rule of law. And so here we are proposing a law, but yet we're giving ourselves a back door with which to escape if we don't hit that rule of law. So do you really believe in the rule of law? Or is it only, well, we'll believe in it as long as it works for us, and when it doesn't, then, well, no, hang on, we're going to, we don't want to follow that. So kind of sends some mixed messages. Again, it's not that I'm saying I'm not prepared to support the legislation. I'd rather have something rather than nothing. As my colleague said, there was a lot of changes that were on the books when the former NDP government was looking at legislative time, and unfortunately there's only so much you can get done in that time. But that was one of the things that we were certainly going to look at, and it would have been better to see a fixed election, or a fixed budget date rather than a budget period. So, I guess when we're faced with things like, the big job losses that we've seen here in the province, especially as of late during the pandemic, no commitments to help people, with their financial struggles, no commitments to help school boards in educating Albertans' children, no supports when it comes to Alberta businesses and the landlords. I guess I shouldn't be surprised when I don't see any real commitments when we talk about a fixed budget date versus a budget period. But like I said, perhaps maybe throughout the process, Committee of the Whole, maybe there'll be a chance to maybe make some suggestions of how we could strengthen the language that is presented. Something's better than nothing, but I would like to see a better something rather than nothing. But I do look forward to seeing some more of the debate here this morning on Bill 4, and hopefully we'll get a chance to maybe offer some suggestions in Committee of the Whole on how we can make Bill 4 a little bit more predictable, maybe a little bit more accountable for the government, so that Albertans can maybe finally start to have some confidence in how their government is running the province here in Alberta.
Standing Order 29-2A is available. Seeing none, are there any other members wishing to speak to the bill? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Gold Bar.
Madam Speaker, and I want to thank all of my honourable colleagues who have weighed in on debate on this legislation already. I think they've hit on some of the important things that need to be considered when considering how to vote on this piece of legislation. One of the things that has come up time and again in the comments that we've heard about is the fact that this legislation doesn't really comply with recommendations from the McKinnon panel report. And in fact, I went through and reviewed the McKinnon panel report, and indeed it is true that the McKinnon panel report did recommend setting a fixed date rather than a fixed election period, which is what we see here. And so, far be it from me to criticize the government from walking away from a recommendation in the McKinnon panel report. I reviewed the report. There are some 25 recommendations. And in fact, I would encourage the government to continue down this path and reject the other 24 recommendations that the McKinnon panel report, in addition to rejecting the recommendation made to establish a fixed budget date. And indeed, I think there are probably many members of the caucus in the party opposite that are quietly wishing that the government would walk away from some of these recommendations as well. I look at the recommendation that the McKinnon panel report made to renegotiate the agreement with the Alberta Medical Association. That's not going particularly well, and certainly we've heard from many rural doctors all across rural Alberta that the government's ham-fisted dealings with the Alberta Medical Association are creating a lot of consternation for rural MLAs. And I know that we've seen a number of rural doctors pulling out of locations all across the province. And so I'm certain that those conversations are going on behind closed caucus doors, that perhaps the government should review that recommendation. With respect to other recommendations that I think the government should probably reject, in addition to their move to reject this recommendation from the McKinnon panel to establish a fixed budget date, I certainly am concerned about the budgets with respect to advanced education. McKinnon panel report recommended that the funding mix for advanced education institutions in this province should fall more in line with those of British Columbia, Ontario, and the other large provinces. Well, Madam Speaker, this is certainly having this move to comply with the McKinnon panel's recommendations has certainly had a significant impact on an institution in my riding. The Campus St. Jean, a faculty of the University of Alberta, is facing over 40% cuts and will reduce probably 70 programs that will significantly affect Francophone rights in the province of Alberta to receive higher education in the language of their choice, and will certainly diminish the ability of people to receive higher education in the official language of their choice. So it's curious to me, Madam Speaker, that on a number of occasions the government is holding the McKinnon panel up as a shield for these really unpopular decisions. But when it comes to establishing a fixed budget date, well, who's Janice McKinnon? We've never heard of her. And the report is just sitting on a shelf, not being dealt with, a lot like the Fair Deal panel report. So we think that, I certainly just want to reiterate that I applaud the government's move to move away from this recommendation in the McKinnon panel report and encourage them to walk away from the other 24 recommendations as well before it's too late. On the issue, though, of transparency, I do want to highlight the fact that time and again we've seen members of this government claim to be open and transparent, and yet when pushed to be actually open and transparent, they fail to do so. And I refer, of course, to the COVID pandemic government response debate that we had yesterday.
Currently on second reading of Bill 4, which for your record is the Fiscal Planning and Transparency Fixed Budget Period Amendment Act 2020. I will remind you to steer back towards that debate instead of the many other debates in which we've already heard in the 5 minutes in which you've been speaking. So, Honourable Member, I'm speaking right now. I will ask the Honourable Member from Edmonton-Goldbar to please proceed with the debate on Bill 4.
Well, absolutely, Madam Speaker, and of course the issue is transparency. It's right there in the label. It's right there in the title of the Act. We're dealing with fiscal transparency in this case, and certainly the issues of fiscal transparency were nowhere to be seen during the budget during the COVID pandemic debate yesterday, when 18 of 23 cabinet ministers were.
I will give you one more chance to speak on the matter in which we are currently debating. Otherwise, we will move on with another speaker.
Well, Madam Speaker, I'm doing my best to convince you that, in fact, the issue is transparency. And it's right there in the title of the bill. I'm certainly encouraging, in my comments related to this piece of legislation, the government to honor its commitment to transparency. And in speaking to this bill, I think it's important that the government demonstrate a genuine commitment to transparency, which we haven't seen yet from this government. And on the issue of transparency, I will leave what appears to be a contentious sore point for the UCP caucus and talk about the fact that we have seen issues of transparency with respect to budget-related matters. And I think my honourable colleague from Edmonton Whitemud has raised a number of issues with respect to budget transparency in the past. She highlighted the education minister's promise to not cut funding to education, and when in fact, days later, those decisions were reversed. And so it is critical to the sound operation of the public sector in this province that public sector agencies who are receiving money from the Treasury have a clear understanding of what they can expect in their budgets. And so I appreciate that the Executive Council wants to provide some level of transparency, and I would encourage them to do so not just by establishing a fixed budget date rather than a fixed budget period as proposed in this legislation, but also in making sure that they honor the commitments that they make in the public statements around the budget. So, we have certainly heard from many members of the public that they are shocked and appalled that a minister could stand up in a press conference and promise to keep funding that was in the budget for educational assistance, and then only a few days later announce that those people were going to be laid off. This is the opposite of transparency. This is the opposite of accountability. And so, it's probably beyond us to be able to legislate ministers honoring their commitments that they make in press conferences. But that's certainly what a lot of my constituents would like to see, is that ministers who make these kinds of public commitments about the budget actually be able to honor them, and that there be consequences for them for going back on their word. So I would certainly encourage the government to put its mind to how it can actually do a better job of keeping its public commitments with respect to budget, more than just committing to bringing down the budget during the month of February. Madam Speaker, it is really a shame with respect to, again, accountability and transparency with respect to the budget. I appreciate, on paper that the members are opposite are committed to enhancing accountability and transparency with respect to the budget. What we've seen, of course, I've mentioned before, with respect to the lack of credibility around the statements with respect to certain items of the budget is concerning, but also the processes with which the government has used to pass the budget. March 17th, we passed the budget for the province of Alberta, even though we hadn't gone through the proper means of examining the departments individually. That was all fast-tracked under the guise of a pandemic.
For Drayton Valley, Devon.
Madam Speaker, I rise to speak to a point of order under Standing Order 23B, speaks to matters other than the question and the discussion. Madam Speaker, when I look at this bill, I see a bill that talks about setting a particular date for when the main estimates will be tabled. I see a bill that speaks to that issue. It's not a very thick bill. It's not very wide. It's not very long. It's not got a lot of breadth or depth to it. It's a pretty succinct piece of legislation that I would expect that the members of this House would be able to speak to. What I hear is somebody that's speaking to an awful lot of other issues, but nothing that goes directly to the question under discussion.
Member for Calgary Mountain View.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. The member is correct. The purpose of debate in this place is to focus on the bill. But I think that part of the bill presumably would be the title of the bill, which speaks specifically to transparency. And so the communications around this bill, all of the documentation around the bill, everything that the government and the government members have been saying about this bill to the public is supposedly how it's supposed to increase transparency. Obviously, we quibble with the increasing of transparency. We disagree, and we don't think, in fact, that this is intended to increase transparency. And in fact, it doesn't do what it is purported to do. So I think the member is speaking to that. I think there is a long history of folks having latitude to speak to that in this place. Certainly, particularly as a result of the debate yesterday, which was sold as something other than what it was. The government members seem to be more than usually sensitive about their lack of transparency. But that doesn't change the fact that transparency is an issue that the government has raised in relation to this bill, and therefore speaking to transparency.
Member, I think we're wading into a whole different debate right now, but in fact the debate should be on the point of order that was raised. However, I am prepared to make a ruling, and while I find no point of order on this particular area, I do express some caution into which the member's debate was heading into, which is proceeding with a matter of debate which has already been settled, which is matters in this assembly that have been dealt with. So I will again express caution. Let's move back on to the debate of Bill 4 and see where we get with that. Honourable Member for Edmonton Gold Bar, please proceed.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank the Honourable Member from Calgary Mountain View for articulating what I thought was a particularly cogent argument. I'm I'm sorry that the member from Drayton Valley Devon hasn't missed me as much as I've missed him. I've certainly sat patiently through everything that he's had to say, and it certainly would be nice if he would extend me the same courtesy, especially since our time together here is short. We don't know how much longer either of us are going to be here, and I think we should really work to treasure all of the time that we have together and not seek to shut each other down. With respect, though, to accountability and transparency when it comes to the budget, of course, many of my constituents were concerned with the lack of accountability and transparency with which the government short-circuited the normal budget processes here. And you know, we certainly think that accountability and transparency are important pieces of the budget process. And that's why we think that that establishing a fixed budget period is probably a good idea. But this piece of certainty is meaningless in the face of a government that is intent on circumventing accountability and transparency in a whole host of other measures, which I've already outlined. And so, you know, I certainly don't want any of my constituents to think that this legislation is anything more than just public grandstanding and is not a genuine commitment, in my view. I don't think it's a genuine commitment to enhancing accountability and transparency when it comes to the budget process here in Alberta. So, you know, I think that my colleagues here also have a number of things that they would like to say. Again, I just want to express my support for the idea of enhancing accountability and transparency around budget processes, and I would certainly encourage the government to do better when it comes to that. And I've highlighted a number of ways. We live in hope that perhaps the government will do a better job going forward with respect to accountability and transparency in the budget. And certainly, I know that as a representative for the people of Edmonton Gold Bar, I will continue to demand that from this Executive Council. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Standing Order 29-2A is available for any members wishing to give comments. Seeing none, are there any other members wishing to speak to Bill 4 in second reading? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Highlands Norwood.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And this is my first time speaking since we've returned, and so I just want to take a moment to, as always, thank our frontline workers and our healthcare workers. And you know, I've mentioned this in the House before, but we are, you know, quite privileged to have the roles that we have, and I just think we need to every day show our gratitude to those frontline healthcare workers, those essential workers who are doing so much for all of us, and we can be here. And I also just want to mention, you know, of course, you know, those whose lives have been lost. I know our Chief Medical Officer of Health always says it quite poignantly when she mentions the numbers. She points out that each of these folks had a story, and that needs to be remembered. And I think about Benito Quesada, who just lost his life. He was a 51-year-old father of 4 who worked at the Cargill plant. So condolences to his family and friends. So I'd like to rise and speak today to Bill 4. I won't speak too long because I know I have another colleague who would like to speak as well. And it's very hard to, as always, follow the member from Edmonton Gold Bar. He took a lot of my points that I was going to make, I must note. So I will say them again, just perhaps not as well. You know, echoing his comments as well as the comments of a number of my colleagues who've spoken today, this was an opportunity for this government to bring forward legislation that really would address the title of legislation around a fixed budget period, having an actual fixed budget date. By instead passing legislation that has a range of 28 possible dates, as the member from Edmonton Gold Bar so aptly stated, this is very much at odds with our Premier's own blue ribbon panel, the McKinnon panel. And it's interesting, of course, that panel, as has been noted, called for a hard, fixed, predictable date for a budget every year. And this bill does not do such a thing. So it's interesting to me that we have a government that, has put so much weight on panels and on, hand-picked panels, in fact, yet they seem to be picking and choosing the recommendations. So it does cause one to question perhaps the necessity of such a panel when this government is ultimately going to do whatever the heck they want anyways. So leads us to some pretty important questions. And my colleague from Edmonton Whitemud spoke about the World School Boards. And she worked with Alberta Education. I did as well. I was a teacher. I was a vice principal. We worked with budgets. We know how important it is to have predictability in the budgeting process, especially at a time when school boards and schools are facing a whole heck of a lot of unpredictability from this government, especially when they're facing a government that's making budgeting extremely challenging. And they're having to make very difficult decisions regarding budgeting. So I wonder, and we're early into the reading of this bill, so I do hope that that the government considers the needs and the wishes of school boards as we move forward with this. And perhaps if there are to be amendments, and I'm not sure, I certainly won't speculate on what any amendments could be, but this is, like I said, this is truly an opportunity. If this government is going to claim fiscal transparency, well, here's an opportunity to do so in a way that many stakeholders would support. We also disagree that there should be no penalty if the government fails to live up to this legislation. As has been noted, in fact, even by government members, this is very thin legislation. There's not a whole heck of a lot there. Again, makes you question, if we're here in the midst of a pandemic, why ram this through when it does seem to be fairly thin? I'm not sure how much consultation took place with this bill. I'd love to hear from the members opposite. Perhaps they can shed some light on this. And it also brings up the question of accountability. We've spoken on a number of occasions in this House around accountability. And we wonder, given the fact that there's no fixed budget date and there's no incentives or sanctions to hold Cabinet accountable for their actions here, then, I think it's fair to ask that question around who's going to be monitoring any decisions that this government makes? And the reason why I bring this up is I think about Bill 10 and I think about the sweeping powers, given to Cabinet. And so there seems to be a bit of a trend with recent legislation introduced by this government. So, as I said, I won't speak too long because I know I have a colleague who'd like to speak as well. But I really would like to urge the government to consider truly what is the purpose of this legislation? Why pick and choose recommendations of your own blue ribbon panel, the McKinnon panel? Because you can pretty much count on us questioning the same thing in the future when you are supporting recommendations and you're pointing to the McKinnon panel. So again, think about this. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Standing Order 29-2A is available. I see the Honourable Member for Bonnyville, Cold Lake, St. Paul.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I just wanted to jump up and talk about, because I've sat here and listened quite patiently to what I've been hearing and complaints from the NDP caucus about fixed budget dates. And I'd just like to point out, they often complain that we didn't release our budget until October 24th in 2019. But just to remind the caucus members that they didn't release theirs till October 27th. They talk about school boards and municipalities sitting on pins and needles waiting. Well, we've offered a pretty close date of February to guarantee a budget comes out in February. In 2016, the NDP put out their second budget on April 14th. I can only imagine that the school boards and municipalities sat on pins and needles from January all the way to April 14th. In 2017, they released their budget on March 16th. In 2018, March 22nd. 2019, they didn't put a budget in at all because of the election in April. But just, it's really rich to sit here and listen to these folks complain about how school boards and municipalities are going to sit on pins and needles when we've promised them a date that they can actually look at to set their priorities. The shortest month of the year, we could pick a specific date, I guess, and say February 29th, but that would be a bit of a joke. I think consistency, that municipalities and school boards, that they would know that the money is going to be coming out, the budget would be coming out in February is fairly succinct, I think, and close enough, far more sufficient than the dates that the previous government had. Thank you, ma'am.
Any other members wishing to speak under Standing Order 29-2A? I see the Honourable Member for Calgary Mountain View.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. There's just so much, Madam Speaker, sorry, there's just so much in there that begs correcting. It's difficult to know where to begin. But let's start with this. So when we're talking about school board, the challenge that school boards had, now it's always the case that a government has to tell a school board what they're getting ahead of a budget because of the alignment of budgets during election years. So the member is right in that sense. The difference, I think, he's alluding to the date of the budget, but the difference is that we told school boards what we were getting. They told school boards what they were getting too. They told them they were getting funded enrollment growth, except that's not what they did. There's a word for that, Madam Speaker, but I won't say it because I see that look you're giving me. So, I think when we're talking about the transparency and the people waiting on pins and needles and this and that, it's not necessarily about the date of the actual budget. It's about the ability to communicate with those stakeholders. School boards have to budget as well. And in this year, school boards wrote a budget based on what they were told by this government, and that budget was wrong because what the government told them was wrong. And so that meant not only did they have to deal with the cuts in terms of per capita funding, but they had to deal with additional cuts on top of that because they had overspent in September because they based their spending on what the government told them they were going to get, which was not what they got. So I think there's a pretty big difference between those two scenarios, and I think if we're talking about things that are rich, I think it's pretty rich for the member to try to conflate those things and try to imply that they are in fact the same thing, because they aren't. The other thing the member said was that there was a fixed budget date, and he made some weird joke about the fixed budget date being February 29th. I think what my colleagues were talking about was the fact that there is not, in fact, a fixed budget date. There's a fixed budget period, which is multiple days long, 28 days, I think, long. And so, I mean, to speak to the comments of the member rather than to the substance of the bill itself, I think for him to get up and say that it is rich for my colleagues to make those statements, when in fact those statements are completely factually accurate. And I think the challenge here is that if the member quibbles with the fact that we're saying that they told school boards they were getting a certain amount of money, and then in fact school boards didn't get that amount of money, the solution to that is not to quibble with the fact that we've said it, but just not to do it in future. I think that's probably a solution that everyone would be happier with, because...
Are there any other members wishing to speak to Bill 4 in second reading? I see the Honourable Member for Calgary McCall.
Yeah. And I rise to speak to this fiscal planning and transparency fixed budget period amendment act. I think Bill Title got this one right because it's fixed budget period and there is no date at all, so I agree this part. And it talks about fiscal planning and transparency in budgets, which is one of the most important documents in any government. It sets out the financial policy, fiscal policy for a government for a set period of time. So I think when we talk about having a fixed date to set that policy, it's quite fair that we elaborate on what those policies include, whether there is some pros and cons for setting those policies. School board example was given by my colleagues. In school board cases, it may be wise to have a set date so that school board get money before the start of the school year. In some other cases, it may not be very clear that having a set budget date will make any difference. So I will be talking a bit about the importance of budget and how some of the policies contained in the budget may benefit from a fixed date, and for others, priorities that may not be practical to do so. Second thing, I think this piece of legislation is coming forward as a result of a McKinnon panel, blue ribbon panel, and this piece of recommendation need to be viewed, need to be analyzed in that context with all other recommendations as well. So I suggest that's also fair to talk about those recommendations and set the context for this piece of legislation.
I hesitate to interrupt, but the clock now strikes noon. The House stands adjourned until 1:30 this afternoon.